Well, I think one of the most insightful elements of Hayek's scholarship is his work on the role of prices, yes, the coordinating role of prices that allows individuals to coordinate their activities despite the fact that they may not know each other, yes. So Hayek acknowledges that not only knowledge is scarce, but it's also dispersed. It's specific to the location, specific to time, and because of this marvel of a price system, yes, that's the term he uses, we are able to coordinate our activities. And even though this is, in my view, probably the key insight that we get from Hayek, it's also probably one that is most unappreciated and unacknowledged and maybe taken for granted. And the reason I say so is because, for example, even though I'm a decent student, I usually paid attention in school, I didn't learn about Hayek until my 5th year of higher education. Yes? So late in my master's of economics, Hayek showed up on the reading list as this additional paper that one may read. Yes? So like if you do all the required reading and if you have spare time, go ahead, read the use of knowledge in society. And so I did. And I was amazed by this paper, and with all this naive younghood, I guess, I said, oh my goodness, so people knew about this in 1945, and yet the communism happened. So like I could not reconcile, and I know right now this seems very naive, but I couldn't reconcile that there was this economic calculation debate, and there was this knowledge, yes, about the shortcomings of planning and the impossibility of planning, and yet no one really cared about this. In fact, it was an ignored insight, and in the West, yes, it was the scholarship continued without really acknowledging the shortcomings of planning or even the impossibility of planning. So. Now we have the healthcare debate, yes, and in this healthcare debate, the coordinating role of prices is also ignored, yes. So in the United States, the healthcare debate has been going on for at least 2 decades. It has intensified recently. We even had the government shutdown in the recent weeks because of the healthcare debate, but everyone kind of wants the same thing, yes? So everyone, and I think it's true also in Europe, so politicians all talk about innovative healthcare and affordable healthcare, yes? And there is a certain trade-off between them, but I think the problem that studying Hayek becomes, the problem that is very clear after one studies Hayek's work is that the policies that are chosen and the policies that are advocated by politicians currently do not serve those goals. Yes? So as economists, we are not to judge the goals. We are only to talk about the means that are selected in order to accomplish these goals. And I think it's very clear, and this is what Hayek would say, in my view, is that the policies that were in place before the Obama healthcare reform and the ones that came with the healthcare reform do not serve the goals of innovative and affordable healthcare. So both of the systems, so the pre-reform and the post-reform healthcare systems, in both of those systems, high expenditure, high medical expenditure was a big concern. Yes, so in the United States, the expenditure per patient is highest among the developed nations, and yet the results are not much better. Yes, and there's a couple of factors that explain this high expenditure. So one of them is just income growth. Yes, wealthier people, the wealthier the economy, the more is spent on healthcare. Yes, the more it's a good, it's a normal good. So with income we spend more on it. Second, technological innovation. Yes, so no one here is surprised that we spend more on computers and gadgets than our grandparents. Yes, I don't need to convince you that that's the case, and it's not a bad thing. Yes, that we can buy laptops and iPhones and iPad and all those toys. and our grandparents didn't really spend any money. It's not a reason to complain, yes, that they saved on those items. Yes, so it applies to healthcare. We just, because of innovation, because of progress, we can buy more. So that's a good thing, yes, that's a positive thing. It's consistent with those goals of innovative and affordable healthcare. However, one of the key contributors, yes, to this rise in healthcare expenditure are policies, yes. So the two things that I just said, yes, so innovation and income growth, this is not only true in the United States, but it's also true in Western Europe. So why is it that in the United States the expenditure is so much higher, yes? And I think there are two policies that are specific to the United States that explain this high expenditure. And the first one is tax exemption on healthcare as a part of your compensation. So that started in the 1950s, yes, 1954. It's this IRS decision that compensation in the form of healthcare is not tax exempt. So basically, it's an implicit subsidy to buying health insurance. And the second policy, which followed just 11 years later, is this Medicare and Medicaid. So this is insurance for impoverished and the elderly. Now, these two policies created third-party payment system, and I want to make a clarification here. Even though they are called insurance, so both Medicare and Medicaid are referred to as insurance plans, and so are those plans that are purchased by employers. They are also called insurance. They are not insurance, yes, because as economists we know that insurance is something that insures you against unexpected. However, the fact that you need to buy your allergy medication every month or your contraceptives, that's not unexpected. Yes, that's something that, so it shouldn't really be a part of the insurance. And if it is, then we should talk about healthcare programs, yes, or some not really an insurance. So those healthcare programs, they because of the implicit subsidies through the tax exemption and direct subsidies in the form of Medicaid and Medicare, they have driven demand. So, you know, subsidy demand curve shifts out, and that means now prices that for people who are not covered by the two policies are higher, yes? So one of those unintended consequences of having tax exemptions and having Medicare and Medicaid is that now prices outside of for people who do not fall in who are not covered by those programs are much higher. Yes? So it discourages entrepreneurship. It keeps people in their jobs because if you change your job, you may no longer be covered by the new insurance company and so on and so forth. So many unintended consequences, which Obamacare addresses through more policies. Yes, instead of rethinking the policy in terms of what it is that's causing those problems, they are adding more policies to kind of try and solve what's already in the system. But I think Hayek's insight about the role of prices, they speak most directly to this third party payment. So let me ask you this question. Let's say you have suffered from an ongoing headache, not really painful, but annoying, yeah? So you decided, after a week or two, you decided you are going to go and see your doctor. And your doctor offers you two options. One option is a CT scan, a CAT scan, yes, and that's going to be £100, and it will reveal or it will provide information about 95% of possible causes for the headache, yes? So £100, 95% accurate. And the second option that the doctor offers is MRI, and the MRI is more accurate, so it's 98% accuracy, and it's £1,000, yes? So which one do you choose? Do you want to pay the £900 for the 3%?
No.
Of course not, yes? So so most of us, I would say, most people say no, yes, in this. So, and reviewed preferences, if you look at actual private transactions, yes, when people pay out of pocket, most of them go with the cheaper option and forego that 3% of additional accuracy. Now, what happens if you're insurance provider pays for your exam? Which one do you choose? The $1,000, yes. And of course, now this is a hard, I did not expect this, but for my students it was a hard sale, yes. They didn't believe that people are actually this mean, yes, and why would they do that? No, that's, so they were actually getting upset with, when I said that, you know, this is how people behave. But there are surveys, and there was this experiment done where doctors were encouraged to have this conversation with their patients and to present those options, and more than 90% of the patients still made the choice that we would expect them to make. Yes? So this was insured patients who were asked to basically consider the costs, the expenditure, the medical expenditure. Yes, and they choose the more expensive option because, of course, they don't feel the scarcity. Yes, they don't feel the scarcity, and they don't feel that trade-off. So now, of course, the response is very different. The response would be very different. That if you ask them, well, if you take the cheaper option, you can take £900 home, yes? Then the response is very different. But they don't, the system, the way it's laid out, doesn't allow them to acknowledge this scarcity. So, so that's a big problem, yes? That is the reason why this, why we had felt, why we have experienced this growth of expenditure. And I think one of the important elements here is that it's not only about prices, yes, because, you know, in communism there were prices, but those prices were from the ceiling, yes, they just sat down in a meeting, had a bit of vodka, and decided about the prices for the next year. But that's not the way to go to have prices. What you need for prices is private property, yes, because you need private property rights, and this is where Obama administration really gets it wrong, yes, because it's maybe they've read Hayek on the beach or something, because recently they came up with this requirement that hospitals are required to publish the lists of prices, yes, so no more secrecy. Now everyone is allowed to know what the prices that hospitals charge to insurance companies and to their patients are, yes. So the requirement is out there, and the hospitals publish their prices. Of course, no one does that to Target or Walmart. Yes, there is no need to require Walmart to publish their prices, because all you need to do is go to the store and they are out there. Yes. So so the hospitals ended up publishing those prices, but it still does not address the core problem. Those prices are just like Soviet prices. They are meaningless because they are not embedded in private property rights. These are prices that no one really pays. Yes, the patients don't pay them, it's the insurance company that pays them, and insurance companies most of the time will go back and negotiate with the hospital and will try to get a lower price. Yes, so so it's the hospital lists are meaningless, and so in the end, I think we need to repeat and restate and just make sure that those lessons of economic calculation debate, yes, and the Mrs. point about private property rights, and then Hayekian coordinating role of prices, they are key insights, and they are extremely important. They were extremely important to the in why the communism didn't work out, and they are also and they also provide an explanation for why the healthcare system that the United States has implemented is not going to work. And now I'm really glad that I'm the first one to go, because I think there's a paper on insurance, so it's a nice follow-up, yes, because my conclusion is really Hayek was not an anarcho-capitalist, yes, so he didn't believe that there's no role for the state, and that you know, the healthcare system should be completely privatized. But I think based on what we have learned from the Constitution of Liberty, Hayek would advocate a policy that still maintains some market mechanisms. So probably a combination of maybe requiring a catastrophe insurance. And oh, by the way, this is not just a digression. Yes, what happens to language? The classical liberal language is we always have to, so now I have to say catastrophe insurance instead of saying insurance, yes, because insurance was captured to mean those health programs, yes, but catastrophe comes with insurance, yes, so I think Hayek, yes, he would advocate for catastrophe insurance combined with some savings plans and so on and so forth. I don't really have an exact idea here. I think one of the speakers that will come after me will have more to say about that. But he would, in my view, it's clear that he would be very much against the pre-Obama reform healthcare system and the one that came afterwards. So, thank you.
My paper proposes what I consider to be a Hayekian approach to state-supported healthcare. Hayek provided for redistribution. He was a classical liberal, but he refrained from proposing policies which might distort price signals. In my paper, I advocate for direct cash transfers to the poor without any associated mandate or comprehensive coverage requirement. Over the course of my remarks, I will briefly restate and expand upon some of my written arguments while discussing possible holes in the proposal. I came to write this explanation of a Hayekian healthcare policy for two main reasons. The first was the debate surrounding the Affordable Care Act, in which a great number of people who had shown little to no prior interest in Friedrich Hayek attempted to use his work to support their preconceived healthcare proposals. Hayek's inclusion in this debate can't be taken lightly. The fact that he was invoked by both the left and the right during this discussion points to a resurgence of interest in his work that we might not have seen before the 2008 financial collapse. It is unfortunate, however, that no one was really willing to explore what sorts of healthcare policies Hayek might have come up with. On the left, politicos focused on Hayek's classically liberal acceptance of some sort of welfare state. While never questioning how Hayek's pursuit of market prices would interact with the mandated coverage requirements under the Affordable Care Act. On the right, conservatives pointed out that Hayek would have an issue with these mandated coverage requirements, but then attempted to defend the status quo as some sort of free market approach to healthcare, which, with the system of government incentives, which lead people to purchase insurance through their business place as opposed to the private market, can't be seen as any kind of free market for health insurance. Most of these efforts only underscored how poorly Hayek is understood by contemporary political contributors. But the insincere contortion of Hayek's work led me to wonder what a Hayekian system of health insurance might actually look like. The second factor that brought me to this topic was David Goldhill's book, Catastrophic Care: How the American Healthcare System Killed My Father and How We Can Fix It. Goldhill argues that current dysfunction in the American healthcare system stems from a set of warped incentives. I agree with him on this completely. His proposal, however, consists of a two-tiered solution, which I feel inadequately addresses the power of rent-seeking corporations. Under Goldhill's plan, many services would be left to the market to provide, and a base health stipend provided to the poor. However, certain catastrophic conditions would then be covered by insurance. While much of this plan makes sense, the basic health stipend could only be used to purchase some standardized notion of healthcare, which opens the proposal to rent-seeking. As well, providers of specific, expensive services would likely lobby to have the conditions they mend considered catastrophic, and therefore merit this state intervention. I sought to imagine a healthcare system that Friedrich Hayek could actually endorse, free of the problems associated in Goldhill's proposal. I think that mandateless cash transfers redistribute with the least possible impact on market competition and prices. I don't think that a mandate is really wise or in any sense necessary. Eric Agner, who's a great Hayek scholar at GMU, argued that people able to purchase health insurance generally do purchase it. This is somewhat supported by car insurance data. In all states within the US, it's mandated that automobile owners, drivers, purchase some sort of insurance. However, 13.8% of drivers remain uninsured. This is despite a mandate. At the moment, 15% of Americans have no health insurance. A mandate has not eliminated uninsured driving, and I don't think we can really expect one, especially a mandate coupled with all sorts of incentives which drive up the cost of health care. These are comprehensive insurance requirements or coverage requirements, would really reduce the number of uninsured individuals. As soon as a mandate is introduced, the state must come up with some standard for what is considered health care, which will lead current providers to lobby the state to exclude competitors from its definition of health care. Prices between included and unincluded services will be influenced by the free money available for the purchase of approved healthcare services. I think it is important to note, though, that any kind of transfer without an associated mandate will be politically difficult to implement. You'll have politicians and news services seizing upon cases in which individuals use their health stipend to purchase things which aren't normally considered health care. However, I think that the alternative incentivizes rent seeking and is likely to bring about far worse proposals. I struggle slightly with determining the size of the cash transfers and how these transfers would be determined. I think this is really the largest hole in this sort of a proposal. I debated tying the transfers to some kind of healthcare goods basket, the median price of health insurance, but this would then still incentivize some kind of rent seeking, as providers of the polled goods would be seen as more necessary or legitimate than the providers of other types of medical services. It would also encourage overbilling, as over time, increases in the price of healthcare would lead to an increase in the amount of money redistributed for the purpose of purchasing it. Hayek does have a great quote regarding the difficulty of coming up with some sort of standard of healthcare, which appears in the Constitution of Liberty. He says, "There is no objective standard for judging how much care and effort are required in a particular case. Also, as medicine advances, it becomes more and more clear that there is no limit to the amount that might be profitably spent in order to do all that is objectively possible. Moreover, it is also not true that, in our individual valuation, all that might yet be done to secure health and life has an absolute priority over other means." We think about the example of a man on his deathbed who, with $10,000, can either extend his life by an additional week or fly his distant relatives out to see him one last time in his last day on earth. I think there are many individuals who would choose to spend that money to see their relatives, people they love, instead of merely extending their physical life a little bit longer. It's important to leave these sorts of decisions in the hands of individuals instead of allowing the state to make these sorts of determinations. As well, our current system of providing health insurance through the state, insurance that is regulated, cuts out a lot of services which are legitimately considered health care. At present, when patients are told that they're at risk for high cholesterol, their doctor tells them that they ought to eat healthier and exercise more, but that he can also prescribe them a pill to reduce their cholesterol. Current state-regulated insurance plans will cover the pill, but I can't purchase a health insurance plan which will reimburse me for the time I take off work to exercise or the greater cost associated with eating in a more healthy fashion. I have no guarantee that there's great demand for this sort of an insurance plan or that it would be at all economically viable. But under contemporary coverage requirements, no one is able to try this. We never get to know if these sorts of ideas could work, and I think that's a major failing of comprehensive coverage requirements. As well, and as was stated by Marta, when comprehensiveness is mandated in health insurance, not only are the wants of individuals disrespected, but insurance becomes total cost pooling. Insurance is designed to pool the cost of unlikely occurrences, not routine checkups or procedures. We see this in action all the time with other sorts of insurance. Car insurance doesn't cover my oil change. When I repaint the window trim around my house every spring, I don't attempt to get my home insurer to reimburse me for the paint. Because repainting my trim is a regular, predictable cost, many businesses, Home Depot or Lowe's, can compete to provide me with paint, and there's no reason to pool this cost with other homeowners. As well, Marta spoke about the third-party issue. When purchasing health insurance, the individual eventually receiving health care is not actually the consumer of the service or the purchaser. The insurance company purchases the health care on the patient's behalf, but doesn't always have the same interests as the patient. Hayek understood that the potential value of the middleman, but he would not have attempted to impose middlemen on all goods. The price of LASIK is an incredibly important demonstration in this. Because LASIK has not been included in insurance, most insurance plans, when it was a new service, didn't see it as important, valuable. The state took forever to take notice of it. So when it started, LASIK cost about $2,500 per eye. Because it wasn't covered by insurance, those seeking LASIK shopped around, and LASIK providers competed with one another to provide them with corrective eye care. As a result, over the past 10 years, the price of LASIK has fallen from $2,500 per eye to near $500 for both eyes in some cases. This is fantastic and has occurred without government intervention or insurance. In imposing a middleman, we ignore the reasons why a middleman might be chosen, namely that they reduce transaction costs. Instead, we simply assume that middlemen are useful for this service, but somehow not for others. There doesn't seem to be much basis for this understanding within healthcare. Finally, there's an argument for this Hayekian approach which almost has a utilitarian feel, which may be valued by some on the left. In instances in which the poor are either provided with state-approved health care, a la Medicaid, or are simply unable to afford any sort of health insurance because they lack the ability to pay, the knowledge they hold about health care, their wants, their desires, go unheard and underutilized. They lose the ability to take part in a societal discovery process through which more desired healthcare options are pursued. Other market actors are in turn deprived of the knowledge needed to provide the greatest number of improvements to the greatest number of people's health. Minorities are well served by this decentralized, cash transfer-based approach. Transgendered individuals have long been targets of state oppression, yet within the medical community and the healthcare field, they've done very well because medical service providers, eager to gain some remuneration for the provision of services, have come up with new and novel ways of lowering the pain and cost of the transition process. I think a system in which cash is transferred directly to individuals to purchase their health care would help to encourage these sorts of solutions to problems that might not even be realized if we were taking a collective state look at how to research and provide care. If the state makes decisions regarding what health care is included in insurance plans, and therefore what sorts of healthcare strategies are pursued, researched, and expanded upon, any input the population may have is tangled and twisted by the political process. With this proposed Hayekian policy, everyone is provided with a basic voice in the process of healthcare development, without warping their input or placing a cap upon how much a given individual may trade in pursuit of his conception of good health. The exercise of this individual voice does nothing to impede the abilities of others to pursue their conceptions of good in healthcare. And as a result, by proposing this Hayekian approach, I hope to include a greater number of people within the healthcare discovery process, while simultaneously giving greater health to the poor. Thank you.
Have it up there? Perfect. Thank you. Let's talk about education. Final session, always thank you for that. Quite tiring, I know that, after a day like this. I'm going to try not to bore you, but if I do, well, tough luck, because you have to listen to me anyway. So I wrote this essay, Hayek and Education, and entitled it The Designing Markets for Spontaneous Orders, perhaps provocatively in front of an audience like this. But I will try and explain why I did it in the course of this presentation. And first, it's just important to understand the problem that we're talking about here. Education, as it's currently carried out, hasn't really changed much at all in the past 200 years. It is a factory model of education that was invented in Prussia, and whereas most other sectors of society has gone through radical transformations, education has not. And this is a conundrum to many, perhaps. I do think that Hayek and the broader Austrian school have something to say about that, and this is what I'm going to talk about. First of all, we go to kind of a straightforward application of Hayek's idea to the issue of education. So education systems in the world traditionally have been very centralized. They have been heavily regulated in terms of both ownership requirements and minimum curricular requirements and so on and so forth. There's been traditionally very little freedom. The American public school system is kind of the epitome of that system, also here until 1988. So what Hayek obviously would say here is that the lack of markets here is probably key for its stagnation. According to Hayek, of course, that's what we've been talking about. I'm just recapping. Markets are discovery processes that can convey information that is dispersed throughout society and limit individuals' lack of knowledge. And this means that without competition between different independent suppliers and the price mechanism to guide market players, there's very little reason to expect improvements to occur. And while we see here, we're talking about the Scandinavian examples of voucher systems, yes, we see some limited experiments all over the world. I also argue that many of these systems that have been put in place are actually, they suffer significantly from flaws in their system design, and not to mention the experiments that have been carried out in America, very tiny, very cumbersome in terms of regulations and so on and so forth. So I still argue that in most countries education is centralized. So solution here, just based on the general Hayekian idea of information and price mechanisms, some form of parental payments, private school choice, would be necessary to convey information to market players, to schools, in order to understand what parents actually want from education, and to parents which schools are good and why they are good in terms of what type of pedagogical methods they use, right? So this is the kind of straightforward application, as I call it. But then we go to Hayek's very explicit and very scarce views on education, mostly appearing in the Constitution of Liberty from 1960. And there are quite significant kind of discrepancies here between what he says in this discovery process in general of markets and what he talks about education. Education for Hayek, first of all, is compulsory. Compulsory education is necessary. He refers to John Stuart Mill in a long footnote where John Stuart Mill says, is it almost a self-evident axiom and that we need to compel education upon the masses. Now, John Stuart Mill is talking in Victorian England, and the Victorian liberals were obviously very, very concerned with the rise of the working class, and they saw the increase in democracy as inevitable. How are we going to limit the problems of democracy? Well, education, conferring the knowledge to the working classes. That's how we're going to do it, and I do think, to a certain extent, that Hayek agree with them. Not necessarily about the working class, but we'll come back to that later. How much education, according to Hayek, that depends on country circumstances. We're talking depending on the wealth. He's not explicit at all. He says, I'm just going to brush that aside. Depends on the situation. Depends on its even its latitude because of the climate and stuff. But he doesn't really give any argument for that. Why compulsory education is necessary for Hayek is, first of all, because of positive externalities. He explicitly says it's better for me that you are educated. And that is also backed up in recent research. If you're educated and you reach a certain level in randomized tests, you tend to commit fewer crimes and so forth, which is good for the rest of society. So there can be an argument for positive externalities. Also democracy, he argues that without common values and a minimum kind of basic knowledge and numeracy, a democracy can't survive. He provides no evidence for this argument, but that's the argument he makes. But on the other hand, and now it comes to the flip side of this, is that direct government provision of education is dangerous. It's very, very dangerous because it's a source of friction between nationalities. So the idea here is that because people have different conceptions of education and how education should be carried out, and if we force them into one specific kind of mold, we will eventually ensure that violence will occur. And he actually cites von Mises on this, that in Austria-Hungary, where this actually occurred, von Mises said, well, maybe it's better that some pupils or some children aren't educated at all, rather than having their parents go to war and ensure that they can be educated as they want them to be educated. But Hayek normally says, look, this is in multi-ethnic states. Even in less multi-ethnic state, the lack of diversity is stifling. So we come back to this idea of the discovery process. Educational techniques. We don't really know which educational techniques are the best, whatever that means. Well, best for whom, first of all? Is it best for me, best for you? And the market is simply there to ensure that that we can discover what works for everyone, and in order to produce gradual improvements in the system. And that is why this monopolization that the government has carried out over education is so dangerous, because it's kind of the ultimate thing that will prevent this discovery process. And then he comes to another thing, because I admit, but still, we say the government has to compel education, and then therefore we need a minimum content of values and knowledge. Again, he even said that education is not so much about knowledge. And he criticized the Victorian liberals for thinking that it's about conveying knowledge. It's about conveying a minimum kind of value base upon which society and civilization can proceed. We'll come back to that later again. So he comes to the conclusion that the best solution to this balance, you need compulsory education, you need some minimum requirements. How are we going to deal with that? He comes to the idea that the voucher is necessary. That means, yeah, okay, so we have to compel it, we have to pay for some. It's unclear whether Hayek is talking about a means-tested voucher. He alludes to whether or not, okay, for those people who can't pay, we probably have to pay for them. But then he refers to Friedman's voucher idea, which is universal. So we don't really know what he's talking about there. I suspect that he was in favor of a universal voucher as a means to like Friedman, to means-test it in the future. But I'm not sure about that. But the point is that we need to have minimum requirements. The state is involved in basic finance, and then they can pay, top-ups, and then a market could occur among independent providers. So, I mean, this is far from laissez-faire, and this is the direct application of his explicit views on education. This is clearly some form of market design. He understands that, okay, we need to ensure this, we need to ensure that, and then we're coming back to this two-pronged approach, whether or not the markets are there to produce the rules in the first place. And it does seem to be the case that Hayek is suggesting that some rules are beyond the market to produce, and we have to ensure that for them in the first place. And then we let these spontaneous orders decide the rest. And I take the example of curricula here, because in the, let me see if I remember the title, it's a studies on the abuse and decline of reason. He heavily criticizes the special applied schooling, which was very common in the German Realschule and also in the École Polytechnique, because it produces minds predisposed to scientism. By simply imposing them with all these technical knowledge, they would think that all society's problems can be rationally planned away rather than to understand the complexity of the situation. And he emphasizes that they need history, literature, and languages to understand society, its problems, its growth, and the complexity of society. And if that is not the case, they may very well be favorable or in favor of this approach of planning, which in turn may lead them to vote for politicians who've also been trained in this applied technical tradition, and the encroachment, government encroachment in the economy would grow severe. And I would just want to say here that, of course, if we have a diversity of education systems, or a diversity of schools at least, we would expect fewer schools. Not every school would provide this applied tradition, right? Because the German Realschule, that was a German, imposed by the state, so was the École Polytechnique. But the key for scientism and the rise of scientism, in Hayek's view at least, according in this book, is the zeitgeist produced by the French Enlightenment. That this is, it's not something that we were imposed upon in front, but within liberal society, this zeitgeist is growing, right? And in that type of situation, I think that because of high demand for these schools, markets may very well produce such schooling en masse, specialization rather than kind of a liberal general education. And this means that Hayek's ideas of market discovery in general may in fact be predicated on education that is partly shielded from that discovery. Scientism might indeed produce pressure for intervention. So in the future, you might not have any economy or a market economy to intervene if you let them be educated in this tradition, because they will just vote for socialism. And we come to the conclusion that general education, a liberal education, is necessary for liberal society itself. And this is the conundrum with Hayek, of course, because it's preservative. It affirms liberal values, it affirms its tradition at the same time as it allows kind of pedagogical techniques and educational techniques to develop within that system. But either way, the argument here is that some minimum requirements are necessary. He doesn't discuss what those minimum requirements are, but some minimum requirements are necessary, and within that realm that he creates, within the market that is designed, then the spontaneous orders will be developed. But we shouldn't overstate it too much, because it's absolutely clear that liberty is a key value. We can't have too much, we can't have too little, and that's why at the end of the day we don't really know what he actually argued about. Okay, what are the, these minimum requirements that you talk about? Well, doesn't really talk about that. And it's very difficult for anyone to say what those minimum requirements should be. And of course, I do think that he would be very likely to highlight the fact that it's impossible to know how these positive externalities are produced in the first place. All over the world currently, we're talking about PISA, we're talking about TIMSS, we're talking about international test scores as some kind of bulletproof solution to improve our economies, right? That's what we hear in the media all the time. Now, I can just take an example here. In terms of pedagogical techniques that produce high academic achievement, the modern kind of, this progressive idea of teaching is very bad for that. So this idea of letting children, work by themselves in group work and all that stuff, that's bad for that. That's what the academic evidence suggests. At the same time, the same modern pedagogical techniques are good for producing high social capital. What should the state prefer as a matter of policy? Well, we can't say that. So for Hayek, it's definitely clear that the kind of soft quality measures and hard quality measures should not be traded off by some centralized bureaucracy, but in the market, right? So I do think that it would be very, very, I think it would be highlighted the problems that governments are focusing too much on certain metrics. And it's up to the parents to make those choices. Here's my own extrapolation, and this is something that many people might disagree with me on. But either way, I argue that the evidence in education, if you look through school choice literature, which I have done, I've written a book on this topic, and how parents choose their schools, and revealed preferences versus stated preferences, it's pretty clear that in education it is very difficult to observe this hard quality. And when I say hard quality, academic achievement, school effectiveness. And that is not necessarily solved, and that is solved by the market discovery process. This is simply, one example here is that parents often value high average test scores, both in the revealed preferences and also stated preferences, but this is a very poor measure of school effectiveness. There's virtually no correlation between the schools that produce high absolute achievement and the schools that are actually good in producing higher achievement from the baseline which you were at when you entered the school. which is what you're interested in if you actually want to increase your child's achievement. And if that's the case, they may, parents may choose and pay schools that are not effective in terms of raising their children's achievement. They may be very effective in terms of raising kind of this soft quality measures that I just talked about. But there might be an information problem in ensuring that they have access to information so they can make wise choices and making these trade-offs between hard quality and soft quality as they probably want. Because we do know that parents value, school effectiveness, when they say that school academic achievement is so important. And then in many cases they actually choose, you see how they choose, and they choose based on socioeconomic background. Now socioeconomic background, peers' socioeconomic background, it's a very good proxy for absolute achievement. It's very easy to observe, but it's a very poor proxy for school effectiveness. Because the peer effects literature on the flip side here is very, very mixed. So there's virtually, you can't use that proxy. It's not a good proxy. And that's why I'm saying that we need some form of insurance that information can be better in the market. I do not think that the government should be involved in producing information itself. I don't think Hayek would have said that information should be produced by the government, direct government provision. Then we have the problem back to the problem in the first place, right? We have league tables. You choose to focus on certain specific metrics, ignore the rest, and so on and so forth. Instead, if anything, you would probably argue a mandate of the release of information, and then let markets produce new metrics, because it's far from clear what type of metrics we actually need. And this is simply because, value-added metrics, some people say, that measures school effectiveness. The problem here is that value-added metrics are very volatile. They suffer from measurement errors and so on and so forth. So it's not clear at all, and that's why we probably need competition in those metrics as well. So, a couple of short conclusions before you fall asleep. First, Hayek sees markets as a solution in education, but not free markets. There is a role for market design. It's a continued role for government in terms of funding, curricula, and probably information. And the information issue I draw upon from the fact, if he had the access to the evidence we have today, what would he have done in terms of the information issue? So it is technically the support of a design of market structures in which these spontaneous orders can develop. And I do think that when you read The Road to Serfdom, there is that famous quote where he says that it would be this idea of spontaneous orders, this idea that we shouldn't resort to coercion, is a principle that with an infinite variety of applications. And he says it's of course much different. It's in particular different to design a market in which these spontaneous orders would produce the most benevolent outcomes than just resorting and leaving institutions as they are. And on that note, I say thank you very much.
Well, I just want to thank each of the three papers and the panelists because they fit together quite nicely, and I really think that there's some ways in which we can talk about how these ideas kind of come together. I guess I'll start off by kind of thinking the big picture, and then I can talk a little bit about each one of your pieces as I read them. First of all, I think that Marta's paper kind of really emphasized and brought to the forefront this problem about economic calculation, about the coordinating role of market prices, and focused on identifying some of the root causes for the perversions that we see in these markets by focusing on the cost issues associated with the Affordable Care Act and how the third-party payer system has introduced these problematic features about the institutional landscape in which healthcare is being provided in the US. And so I think in looking and reading Will's paper after that, it was quite nice because it kind of rounded out the second half of that by looking at the subjective assessment of costs and focusing very clearly on how it is the importance of individuals being able to assess their own costs and to make those decisions for themselves. And so looking at that second component of the role of prices and thinking in terms of a comparative institutional arrangement for how different institutional structures are going to allow individuals to make those subjective assessments better or worse. And so coming to Gabriel's paper, even though it was on a separate topic of education, I think it kind of rounds out this discussion by focusing on some of the knowledge problems associated with choosing or setting the constitutional structure in which these markets can take place. And so emphasizing some of the problems associated with setting what the actual standards are, what the actual rules are, and then allowing markets to function in that way. And so the three papers in my mind build on each other quite nicely. And so I'll start with Marta's paper and kind of work through in terms of talking about some of the problems associated with this. First of all, Marta, I think your argument is dead on in looking at how it is that the problems of the actual institutional structure are what's creating these perverse outcomes that we're seeing in the healthcare market, and identifying particularly this argument that's very common to Hayek about the role of private property in generating the conditions under which prices actually map with real resource constraints, and then reflecting the subjective values of people who are acting on those prices. So you argue that it's this lack of private property rights in the third-party payer system that's really driving it, and you identify the two policy changes that really led to this. One was making the employer-supplied healthcare tax exempt, so implicitly subsidizing this method of providing insurance, and then the second was the Medicare and Medicaid programs that have been established. So I really enjoyed this paper, and I enjoy discussing this idea, but I think that there's a way to kind of take this discussion further, because I'm not sure the argument works entirely the way you want it to, right, as it is right now. Because what we have to identify is what are the ways in which these two features actually structurally distort the private property system from working. So, I mean, you can run an argument where firms have property rights and the contracts between insurance agencies and firms are well defined, and firms are profit maximizers, and so, you know, it may not be much of a commons problem as you may suggest. And, you know, how is it that these third-party payer systems actually distort and attenuate private property rights from actually making the prices work as they do? And so I don't think that this is an unsolvable problem. I think it's something that we can open up and discuss, but it relates also to kind of Will's paper in answering the other side of this equation, in that it's not so much, there's a lack of private property rights, but the way in which these two programs are attenuating the rights in this particular case is by separating the cost from the actual choice of particular healthcare policies. And so I'm kind of thinking about this in terms of ways in which how particular institutional features can kind of bring the cost and choice back to being part of the same decision. Okay? So I really loved in your presentation when you spoke about how the insurance system in the US healthcare market right now is not really actually insurance. And that didn't come across as clear in your paper, but it's incredibly clear in your presentation. And I think that that is what kind of answers this question about how it is these two programs attenuate the private property rights system from actually generating prices that are reflective of costs. So I thank you for that. I think I'll leave with a question on your paper, in that I would like to kind of push you on a little bit of the specifics in terms of, if these two policies were the policies that really kind of drove the distortions in the healthcare system, what do you see as kind of the first best or second best mechanism for going about and addressing these issues in the structural ways in which they distort the private property mechanism from working? That's not an easy question to answer. but it's something that I think that we should put on the table. So secondly, I'll turn to Will's paper and kind of build off of that. Will, I really enjoyed this, particularly because the public policy debate surrounding healthcare choices completely ignores this subjective element of individuals choosing what types of healthcare is proper for them and the trade-offs that they face when they actually have the ability to make accurate choices based on some reasonable information that reflects the cost of supplying these types of healthcare decisions. And I think the bold claim that you present in the paper is that Hayek's central notion of subjective costs actually requires that individual purchasing decisions completely drive healthcare. And this is this is kind of a bolder claim that comes out of your paper in how we think about what types of policies Hayek would recommend versus which ones he may be less inclined to. So again, in many cases, it's not the lack of choice that's the problem, it's the lack of choice being coupled with costs that are reflective of the actual real resource constraints and the way in which they're being used. So I really appreciated that. I think that you did a service by introducing the comparative institutional question by providing the comparison case of the LASIK surgery and how competition disciplined this process and brought down costs and made it much more widely available, and kind of looking for alternatives to the way in which healthcare is currently going in the US. I would suggest perhaps a second comparative institutional case, and I recently have just purchased a kitten, and I've come to find out that pet insurance is incredibly transparent and it's incredibly reflective of the costs associated with owning your pets. So it's much more about insuring against these risks rather than actually paying for the routine care and maintenance of your pet. And as a result, it's quite transparent. It's very easy to kind of understand and learn, and you really know what you're buying when you're buying it. So thinking about some of these other ways in which the institutions align the cost and choice decisions between purchasers and providers, I think is a really wonderful contribution to the debate. You present two views of Hayek's of a Hayekian plan. One is kind of a state-funded emergency care, but you didn't talk so much about that one, and you really focused on this idea about a cash transfer. I think this is very interesting, and I think that you're probably closest to what I think I'm on the same page with you in terms of thinking that Hayek would support something along these lines. Again, it'll run into the questions that Gabriel raises about where do we set those limits and what does that actually entail, and how do we ensure generality when we're talking about something that is quite subjective. So thank you. So the third paper is Gabriel's paper, and it's not on healthcare, but it kind of deals with these kind of more fundamental questions about if we're going to establish these general rules for providing these types of goods, how do we come to determine what these minimum requirements would be? So I think, there's a couple of things that I think were very interesting about your paper. You clearly advance the argument that Hayek would support basic funding and minimum standards. And you clearly state that Hayek would outright reject government provision of state-funded education. And I think that that's correct. But you tended to sidestep a tension that Hayek emphasizes, which is that there's a tendency for government, once they mandate what minimum standards are, to want to go in and then supply that education. And I would kind of want to open up the discussion to thinking about this tension, because in everything that Hayek's written on education and Constitution of Liberty, this tension runs throughout the entire piece. And so I think that it's an incredibly important one for trying to understand where Hayek would come down on understanding where that line of minimum requirements are. I think you did an excellent job highlighting the knowledge problems associated with positive externalities of education and noting that these positive externalities can go either way. And we should take account of those knowledge problems in trying to understand the role of positive externalities in generating, say, a good democracy or perhaps just a good citizenry. So I think that was great. I think you set up kind of an idea about what the minimum requirements, that Hayek would support some minimum requirements but not state what those are. He does hint at this because when he talks about minimum requirements, the only example I believe he gives is reading, just general reading requirements, which is such a far lower bar about what would be required in an educational system that's provided by the state than anything that we have been talking about in terms of curriculum or general aptitude tests or kind of standardizing education across large measures. So I would want to push the discussion in terms of, there's at least a compelling case that Hayek's idea about what a minimum standard is far, far, far below anything that we have in terms of minimum standards in government education today. Do I have time?
Yes, you do. Yeah.
Okay. So I'd want to open up the discussion on that. There was the second, I guess, component or missed component in the debate on education is what Hayek seems to attribute to a special role and a place for children and the way in which children factor into this decision to supply education from the state. He seems to suggest that perhaps because of their place in a liberal society, that may be one of the, to me that's the more convincing of Hayek's arguments as to what he thinks are the reasons for supplying these, for maybe getting involved here. I will conclude that you introduced the idea about information asymmetries, and this was the key point that you want to advocate some kind of a market design for kind of setting the stage for a market in education. And I don't buy your arguments as strongly as you present them, because to me the knowledge problem exists on both sides of that asymmetry, and there are many, many ways in which kind of local communities try to kind of establish and conquer some of the informational asymmetries associated with education. I'm just not very persuaded that education's so much different than all other goods that we consume on a daily basis, that reputation mechanisms and other forms of information transmission are not going to be able to solve those problems. I also don't understand why it would be the case that you can't have another market institution or third party supply that information and supply information on quality. We have all types of ways in which we try to discern quality of education. So I'm just not so convinced that Hayek would advocate the mandating of information from the state, given that the tension that runs up through his literature on this suggests that as soon as you have governments dictating what the mandates will be, you have the same incentives to then get in and start meddling in education markets. And as you aptly pointed out, Hayek thought this was incredibly dangerous, and incredibly dangerous for the polity, but incredibly dangerous for the molding of men's minds. And I think that that's an incredibly important point. I'll just conclude by saying that each of these three papers raises very, very important issues about how we understand kind of setting the constitutional limits, the constitutional debate for the role of government in these types of markets. And each of these three papers, I think, really highlighted this problem which Hayek was very concerned with about the dynamics of intervention. So Marta's paper kind of highlighted some of the root causes, and then Will's paper followed up by saying how those root causes have now led to kind of separating the choices that individuals face from the costs. And I think that Gabriel's paper did a fantastic job about trying to attack the big question about how we set what general rules Hayek would find most appropriate to kind of combating or hopefully limiting the dynamics of intervention moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you.